I was arranging the fresh daisies in my windowsill vase when I heard my daughter's voice drift up from the kitchen below. The words stopped me cold, my arthritic fingers still wrapped around a yellow stem. "We're moving Grandma to a cheaper facility." The casual tone, like she was discussing switching grocery stores, made my blood run ice cold in my 74-year-old veins. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I pressed myself against my bedroom door, straining to hear more of the conversation happening in my own kitchen. After living in this house for 47 years, I knew exactly where every family member would be standing. Margaret would be leaning against the granite counter I'd helped her pick out when she renovated my kitchen last year, supposedly as a gift, but really as an investment in the house she planned to inherit. Her husband Robert would be sitting at my dining table, probably scrolling through his phone, while pretending to listen. "The Willowbrook place is costing us nearly $8,000 a month," Margaret continued, her voice carrying that exasperated tone she'd perfected during her teenage years. "There's a perfectly adequate state facility across town that runs about $3,000. She won't know the difference anyway. Won't know the difference." I'd been living at Willowbrook Gardens for 8 months now, ever since my mild stroke made Margaret decide I couldn't live independently anymore. She'd presented it as the best possible option, a luxury senior community where I could enjoy my golden years in comfort and safety. The brochures she'd shown me featured elegant dining rooms, beautiful gardens, and smiling staff members who looked genuinely caring. What she hadn't told me was that she'd moved me there using my own money. "But Mom seems happy there," came another voice, my youngest daughter Sarah. Sweet Sarah, always the peacemaker, always trying to see the good in everyone's intentions. "She's made friends, she loves the art therapy classes, and the physical therapy team has been helping her regain strength in her left arm." "Sarah, be realistic," Margaret's voice carried that patronizing edge she'd inherited from her father. "Mom's not getting any better. The doctors said the cognitive decline is inevitable at her age. Why waste money on fancy amenities when she's just going to deteriorate anyway?" Cognitive decline. I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling my heart race against my ribs. Yes, I'd had some memory issues since the stroke, some difficulty finding words occasionally, but my mind was sharp, sharp enough to notice that Margaret had been asking me to sign a lot of papers lately. Sharp enough to realize that my monthly statements from Willowbrook had stopped arriving in the mail. "Have you looked at this Sunset Manor place?" Robert's voice joined the conversation for the first time. "I drove by yesterday, it looks clean enough. Basic, but adequate for someone in Mom's condition." Someone in Mom's condition. I was someone in Mom's condition, and I was standing 10 feet away from them, listening to my own family discuss my future like I was already gone. "The thing is," Margaret continued, and I could hear papers rustling, "if we make the move this month, we can probably recover about $40,000 from the Willowbrook deposit. Plus the savings over the next year would be significant. $40,000. My deposit money that would go back into whose pocket exactly?" I moved away from the door, and sat heavily in my reading chair, the same chair where I'd nursed both my daughters, where I'd read them bedtime stories, where I'd helped them with homework through elementary and high school. The chair where I'd held them when they cried over broken hearts, and celebrated with them over achievements. Now they were downstairs planning to warehouse me in the cheapest facility they could find while pocketing the difference. But Margaret had made one crucial miscalculation. She assumed that because I'd had a stroke, because I sometimes forgot where I'd put my reading glasses, or stumbled over words during stressful moments, that I was helpless. She assumed that because I'd trusted her with my financial affairs, I'd stopped paying attention to them entirely. What she didn't know was that I'd been keeping my own records. For 47 years, I'd been the secretary-treasurer of the Riverside Women's Club. I'd managed budgets, tracked expenditures, and caught more than one treasurer trying to skim funds for personal use. Before my stroke, I'd been the volunteer coordinator for 3 different charities, managing donation tracking and expense reports. My organizational skills hadn't disappeared with my health scare, they'd just gone underground. I walked to my dresser and pulled out the bottom drawer, removing a manila folder I'd been keeping since moving to Willowbrook. Inside were photocopies of every document Margaret had asked me to sign, Every bank statement I'd managed to intercept before she could file them away, every receipt and invoice related to my care. What I'd discovered over the past 8 months would have shocked my daughters if they'd bothered to pay attention to anything other than the bottom line. Margaret hadn't just moved me to Willowbrook, using my money. She'd been systematically transferring funds from my accounts into joint accounts that listed her as the primary holder. My savings account, which had contained nearly $200,000 from the sale of some investments, now showed a balance of $37,000. My checking account had been reduced to just enough to cover my monthly expenses. But the real revelation was in the Willowbrook paperwork itself. I pulled out the contract Margaret had helped me sign when I first moved in. According to this document, my care was being paid for through something called the Bennett Family Trust, with Margaret listed as the trustee. The monthly payments of $8,000 weren't coming from this trust, though they were being withdrawn directly from my personal savings account, while the trust money Margaret had established was earning interest in an investment account. My daughter had created a shell game with my own money, making it appear that she was generously covering my care costs while actually using my funds and keeping the trust money for herself. And now she wanted to move me to a cheaper facility and pocket even more of my money. I heard footsteps on the stairs and quickly returned the folder to my drawer. Margaret appeared in my doorway with that bright fake smile she'd perfected for dealing with what she considered my diminished capacity. "Hi Mom, how are you feeling today?" Her voice was the special tone people used for small children and the elderly, overly cheerful and slightly too loud. "I'm feeling quite well, thank you." I kept my voice steady, giving no indication of what I'd overheard. "That's wonderful. I was thinking maybe we could go for a little drive this afternoon. There's a new place I'd like to show you. Sunset Manor, no doubt." I smiled back at her with equal falseness. "That sounds lovely, dear. But first I was hoping you could help me with something. I've been trying to organize my financial papers, and I seem to have misplaced some of my bank statements. Could you help me locate them?" Margaret's smile flickered for just a moment. "Oh Mom, you don't need to worry about those boring financial things. Remember, I'm handling all of that for you now, so you don't have to stress about it." "I know, sweetheart, and I'm so grateful, but my doctor at Willowbrook mentioned that staying mentally active is important for stroke recovery. He suggested I try to keep track of simple things like my monthly expenses, as a sort of therapy." It was a lie, but a plausible one. Margaret's expression shifted to calculation as she weighed the risks of giving me access to information versus the benefits of appearing supportive of my medical care. "Well, I suppose I could bring you copies of the most recent statements. Nothing too complicated, of course." "Of course, and Margaret dear, I was also wondering about that trust fund you mentioned when I first moved to Willowbrook. The Bennett Family Trust. I'd love to understand how that works, just to satisfy my curiosity." This time, Margaret's smile disappeared entirely. "Mom, that's very complex financial information. I don't think it's something you need to concern yourself with. But it's my trust, isn't it? Surely I have a right to understand how my own money is being made." Margaret's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It's not exactly your trust, Mom. It's a family trust that Robert and I established to help manage care costs for family members. You're a beneficiary, but the management decisions are handled by the trustees." "A family trust established with whose money?" I wondered. "I see, and who are the trustees?" "Robert and I are the trustees, Mom. We make the decisions about how the funds are used to ensure you get the best possible care." The best possible care, which apparently meant moving me to the cheapest facility available while pocketing the difference. After Margaret left, promising to return with some basic financial information and plans for our afternoon drive, I sat back in my reading chair and contemplated my options. I could confront her directly, but that would only result in her dismissing my concerns as confusion or paranoia related to my stroke. I could try to contact a lawyer, but Margaret had convinced all my friends and relatives that I was no longer capable of making important decisions independently. Or I could do what I'd always done when faced with a problem that required careful planning and meticulous execution. I could investigate thoroughly, document everything, and then take decisive action. I returned to my dresser drawer and pulled out a small notebook I'd been keeping since my second week at Willowbrook. In it, I'd recorded every conversation with Margaret about my care, every suspicious comment, every time she'd redirected questions about money or legal matters. What I needed now was help from someone. Margaret would never suspect of having the skills or inclination to assist me. I picked up the phone beside my bed and dialed a number I'd memorized weeks ago. Willowbrook Gardens. This is Jennifer at the front desk. Hello, Jennifer. This is Eleanor Bennett, in room 237. I was wondering if I could speak with Marcus from the maintenance department. Of course, Mrs. Bennett. Let me page him for you. Marcus Washington was a 32-year-old maintenance worker who'd been fixing small problems in my room since I'd arrived at Willowbrook.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Unlike the nursing staff and administrative personnel who spoke to residents in patronizing, overly sweet tones, Marcus treated everyone like intelligent adults. He'd grown up caring for his grandmother, who'd had Alzheimer's, so he understood the difference between cognitive impairment and being treated like a child. More importantly, Marcus was working on his bachelor's degree in computer science through online classes, and he'd mentioned several times that he was particularly interested in cybersecurity and financial fraud prevention. Mrs. Bennett, Marcus here, what can I help you with today? Marcus, I have a rather unusual request. I'm wondering if you might be free this evening to help me with a computer problem. Not a maintenance issue, exactly, but something that requires your particular expertise. There was a pause. Marcus was smart enough to recognize that this wasn't a typical request from a 74-year-old woman. What kind of computer problem, Mrs. Bennett? The kind that involves someone using technology to take advantage of someone they assume doesn't understand how technology works. Another pause, longer this time. Mrs. Bennett, are you asking me to help you investigate something? I'm asking you to help me understand some financial documents and online account information that I believe may be more complicated than my family realizes I can comprehend. Marcus was quiet for nearly a minute. When he spoke again, his voice was careful but interested. Mrs. Bennett, I get off work at 6 o'clock. If you'd like, I could stop by your room around 7 to take a look at your computer issue. That would be perfect, Marcus. And Marcus, I think you should know that this might be the kind of computer problem that helps you with your cybersecurity studies. After hanging up, I spent the rest of the afternoon organizing my documentation and preparing for Margaret's visit. She arrived at 3 o'clock, with a thin folder of papers and an overly enthusiastic attitude about our planned drive. I brought you the basic account information you wanted to see, she said, handing me 3 pages of bank statements that showed only the most recent month's activity. Nothing too complicated, just the simple overview. I scanned the pages quickly. They showed my checking account balance and recent expenses, but nothing about the larger transfers or the trust account activity I knew had been happening. This is very helpful, dear. I see that Willowbrook is being paid $8,000 each month. That seems like quite a lot. Margaret's smile tightened. It's a premium facility, Mom. You're getting the best possible care. Oh, I know, and I'm grateful. I was just curious about how the payments are structured. Are they coming from my savings account or from the trust you mentioned? It's complicated, Mom. The important thing is that your care is covered. Of course. And speaking of care, I was talking to some of the other residents today, and several of them mentioned that their families receive detailed monthly reports about their care plans and expenses. I was wondering if we receive those reports too. Margaret's expression shifted to something that looked almost like panic before she regained her composure. Every facility handles their reporting differently, Mom. I'm sure if there were anything important for you to know, they would tell you directly. I'm sure you're right. Now about this drive you mentioned. Where exactly are we going? Margaret brightened. Back on familiar ground. I found a lovely senior community that I thought you might like to visit. Just to see what other options are available. Other options? But I thought you said Willowbrook was the best possible place for me. It is, Mom, but it's always good to know what else is out there. This new place is smaller, more intimate. Some people prefer that kind of environment. Smaller, more intimate, and $3,000 cheaper per month. We drove across town to Sunset Manor, and I had to admit that Margaret's description of the place as adequate was generous. The building looked like it had been constructed in the 1970s and minimally maintained since then. The parking lot had several potholes, and the landscaping consisted mainly of overgrown shrubs and patchy grass. Inside, the facility smelled like disinfectant and cafeteria food. The common areas were clean but utilitarian, with plastic furniture and fluorescent lighting. Most concerning was the staff-to-resident ratio. In the hour we spent touring, I saw perhaps 3 staff members, for what appeared to be at least 50 residents. "What do you think, Mom?" Margaret asked as we concluded the tour with the director, a hurried-looking woman who'd barely made eye contact with me during our conversation. "It's certainly different from Willowbrook," I said diplomatically. "Different how?" "Well, Willowbrook has much more staff available, more activities, better food, nicer accommodations. The physical therapy department is excellent, and the nursing staff checks on residents much more frequently." Margaret's jaw tightened again. "But Mom, those things aren't really necessary for someone at your stage. You don't need fancy amenities. You need basic care and safety." Someone at my stage. There it was again, the assumption that I was already too far gone to benefit from quality care or stimulating activities. "I suppose you're right, dear. When would this move happen, if I decided to make the change?" "Well, there's actually some urgency," Margaret said, glancing at the director. "This facility has a waiting list, but they have an immediate opening due to a recent vacancy. If we wanted to secure the spot, we'd need to make a decision within the next few days." A recent vacancy. Someone had died, and Margaret wanted to move me into their room within days of their passing. "I see, that is quite urgent. I'd like to think about it overnight, if that's all right." "Of course, Mom, but remember opportunities like this don't come along often." On the drive back to Willowbrook, I asked Margaret about the financial arrangements for Sunset Manor. How would the costs be structured there? Would it still come from the trust? Margaret hesitated. "The costs are much lower, so we could handle them differently. Probably just direct payments from your checking account." "And what would happen to the trust money if I moved to a less expensive facility?" "The trust would continue to exist for any future needs that might arise." "Future needs that would benefit whom, exactly?" That evening, Marcus arrived at my room promptly at 7 o'clock. He was carrying a laptop bag and wearing the serious expression of someone ready to tackle a challenging problem. "Mrs. Bennet, before we start, I want to make sure I understand what you're asking me to do. Are you concerned that someone is mishandling your financial affairs?" "Marcus, I'm concerned that my daughter has been systematically moving my money around while telling me it's for my own good, and now she wants to move me to a substandard facility while keeping the difference in care costs for herself." Marcus nodded slowly. "And you want me to help you figure out exactly what's happening with your accounts? I want you to help me document what's happening so that I can take appropriate action to protect myself." "Mrs. Bennet, I need to be honest with you. If we discover evidence of financial fraud or elder abuse, we're going to have to report it to the authorities." I smiled at this young man who'd grown up protecting his grandmother and now spent his evenings learning to protect others from cybercriminals. "Marcus, I wouldn't have it any other way." He opened his laptop and set it up on my small dining table. "Okay, let's start with what you already know, and then we'll see what else we can discover." I showed him my folder of documentation, explaining the discrepancies I'd noticed between what Margaret told me about my care costs and what I could see in the limited financial information I'd been given. Marcus studied the papers carefully, making notes on a legal pad. "Mrs. Bennet, these bank statements only show partial information. To get a complete picture, we'd need to access your full account history and any trust documentation. Margaret has been handling all of that for me. She says it's too complicated for me to understand." Marcus looked up from the papers. "Mrs. Bennet, you managed financial records for multiple organizations for decades. Nothing about basic banking and trust management should be too complicated for you to understand." "That's exactly what I thought." Marcus turned back to his laptop. "Do you remember any of your online banking login information from before your stroke?" "I never used online banking before. I always preferred to handle everything in person or by phone." "That's actually interesting," Marcus said, typing something. Because according to these statements, your accounts have been accessed online regularly for the past 8 months, since I moved to Willowbrook. Exactly. Marcus pulled up what appeared to be a banking website. Mrs. Bennett, I want to try something. What's your social security number? I gave him the number, and he entered it into a password recovery form. The system is asking for verification questions. What's your mother's maiden name? Harrison. What was the name of your first pet? Butterscotch. Marcus continued entering information, and within a few minutes, he'd successfully reset my online banking password. Mrs. Bennett, I'm now looking at your complete account history for the past year. He turned the laptop screen toward me, and what I saw confirmed my worst suspicions. Transaction after transaction showed large transfers from my savings account to accounts I'd never heard of. The Bennett Family Trust appeared to be receiving regular deposits from my accounts, but then showing equal withdrawals to something called BRT Holdings. What is BRT Holdings? I asked. Marcus pulled up another window and ran a search. It's a limited liability company registered in Delaware. The registered agent is, he paused, reading carefully, Robert Thompson. Robert Thompson was my son-in-law's full name. He went by Robert Thompson Bennett socially, but apparently his business ventures used his original surname. So Robert has been moving my trust money into his own company. That's what it looks like. And Mrs. Bennett, there's something else. The trust account shows a current balance of nearly $230,000. I felt my heart skip a beat. That's impossible. Margaret told me the trust only contained about $50,000. Marcus continued typing, pulling up more records. According to this, the trust has been receiving not just your savings transfers, but also payments from something called Willowbrook Gardens direct payment services. What does that mean? It means that Willowbrook isn't just receiving $8,000 a month for your care. They're receiving $8,000 a month, and then paying additional money into your trust account. I stared at the screen, trying to understand what Marcus was telling me. Marcus, are you saying that Margaret has been collecting more money than she's been paying for my care? Mrs. Bennett, I think Margaret has been collecting insurance payments for your care, while also using your personal funds to pay for that same care. She's essentially been paid twice for your expenses, while telling you that your care is costing more than it actually does. The scope of Margaret's deception was far worse than I'd imagined. She hadn't just been moving my money around, or planning to pocket savings from a cheaper facility. She'd been running a sophisticated fraud operation, using my health crisis as cover. What do we do now? I asked. Marcus closed the laptop, and looked at me seriously. Mrs. Bennett, we document everything, we contact the authorities, and we make sure Margaret and Robert can't hurt you or anyone else. How long will that take? If we work through the night, I can have a complete financial analysis ready by tomorrow morning. Then we can contact Adult Protective Services, the police, and your bank's fraud department. I looked at this young man, who was willing to sacrifice his evening to help protect me from my own daughter, and I felt something I hadn't experienced since my stroke. Hope. Marcus, let's get started. Marcus and I worked through the night, like digital detectives unraveling a financial conspiracy. By 3 a.m, we had discovered the full extent of Margaret's operation, and it was far more sophisticated than either of us had initially suspected. Mrs. Bennett, look at this. Marcus said, pointing to a series of transactions on his laptop screen. Your daughter hasn't just been stealing from you. She's been using your situation as a template for a much larger scheme. I leaned forward in my chair, adjusting my reading glasses to see the screen more clearly. Marcus had somehow accessed records showing that Robert's company, BRT Holdings, was receiving payments from multiple sources that appeared to be related to elder care facilities across 3 different states. What exactly am I looking at? Marcus scrolled through the data, his young face grave with concentration. BRT Holdings has contracts with 12 different senior living facilities. Each contract appears to follow the same pattern as what's been happening with your care. Families think they're paying premium rates for luxury care, but the actual care costs are significantly lower, and the difference is being funneled into Robert's accounts. My stomach churned as the implications became clear. You're saying that Margaret and Robert are running this same scam on other families? That's exactly what I'm saying. And Mrs. Bennett, some of these families are paying even more than yours. There's one case here where the family is being charged $15,000 a month for a facility that actually costs $4,000. I felt a wave of rage wash over me that was stronger than anything I'd experienced since my stroke. It wasn't just about my money anymore. Margaret and Robert were systematically preying on vulnerable elderly people and their families during some of the most difficult periods of their lives. How many people are we talking about, Marcus? He continued typing, cross-referencing data from multiple sources. From what I can see here, at least 37 families across Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Total monthly fraud appears to be somewhere around $200,000. $200,000 per month. Margaret and Robert weren't just criminals, they were operating a criminal enterprise that was generating millions of dollars in fraudulent income annually. Marcus, how did you access all of this information? He looked slightly uncomfortable. Mrs. Bennett, Robert isn't very sophisticated when it comes to digital security. He uses the same password for multiple accounts, and many of his business records are stored in cloud services that don't have proper protection. Once I identified the pattern with your accounts, it wasn't difficult to trace the connections to his other activities. I studied this young man who'd spent his evening helping me uncover a massive fraud operation. Marcus, you're going to make an excellent cybersecurity professional. Thank you, ma'am, but right now I'm more concerned about making sure you're protected and that these other families know what's happening to them. We spent the next 2 hours documenting everything Marcus had discovered. He created detailed reports showing the money flows, copied relevant documents, and prepared a comprehensive analysis that would be easily understood by law enforcement and banking officials. Mrs. Bennett, there's something else we need to discuss, Marcus said as he prepared to leave around 5 in the morning. Margaret is planning to move you to Sunset Manor within the next few days. Once you're moved, it's going to be much more difficult for you to take action against her or to access the resources you need to fight this. I hadn't considered that aspect of Margaret's timeline. At Willowbrook, I had privacy, access to my own phone and computer, and staff members like Marcus who treated me as a competent adult. At Sunset Manor, I would likely have much less independence and far fewer opportunities to communicate with the outside world without Margaret's oversight. What do you suggest? I think we need to move fast. Today, if possible, we need to contact the authorities and your bank before Margaret realizes what we've discovered. Marcus was right, but I had learned something important during my decades of managing organizations and volunteers. When you're dealing with people who have authority over you, whether they're school administrators, charity board members, or adult children who've convinced everyone that you're incapacitated, you need to approach the situation strategically. Marcus, I appreciate your urgency, but I think we need to be smarter about this. If I suddenly start making accusations against Margaret, everyone's first assumption is going to be that I'm confused or paranoid due to my stroke. We need to present this information in a way that makes it impossible for people to dismiss. What do you have in mind? I had been thinking about this problem since Margaret first started treating me like I was mentally incompetent. We need allies. People with credibility who can vouch for my mental competence and who can present the evidence independently. What kind of allies? My attorney, for one. Margaret convinced me that I didn't need to worry about legal matters anymore, but I never actually fired him. Dr. Patterson, my personal physician who's been treating me since before my stroke. And Mrs. Chen from the Riverside Women's Club. She's been the president since I stepped down, and she knows better than anyone how detail-oriented I am with financial matters. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. So instead of going directly to the police, we contact people who can verify your competence and help present the evidence. Exactly, but there's something else we need to do first. We need more evidence, and we need to make sure Margaret can't destroy or alter the evidence we already have. What kind of additional evidence? I had been thinking about this throughout the night. Margaret has been asking me to sign papers regularly since I moved here. I've been keeping copies, but I haven't been paying close attention to what all of them were for. I think we need to examine those documents more carefully. I retrieved my folder from the dresser and spread the papers across my dining table. Marcus and I went through each document systematically, and what we discovered was disturbing. Mrs. Bennett, according to these documents, you've signed powers of attorney that give Margaret control over far more than just your financial affairs. She has medical power of attorney, the authority to make housing decisions on your behalf, and something called comprehensive life management authority. What does that mean? Marcus read through the legal language carefully. It means Margaret has the legal right to make virtually any decision about your life, including where you live, what medical care you receive, and how your money is spent. And according to this document, you've waived your right to revoke these powers without her consent. I felt the blood drain from my face. That can't be legal. It's probably not, but it would take a court challenge to prove that, and courts are generally reluctant to overturn documents that appear to have been signed voluntarily. Margaret had been more cunning than I'd realized. While I'd been focused on the financial fraud, she'd been systematically stripping away my legal rights and independence. Marcus, is there any way to prove that I didn't understand what I was signing, or that I was coerced? Some of these documents are dated within days of your stroke, when you would have been in the hospital and potentially not in full control of your faculties. That might be enough to challenge their validity. But that would require going to court, which could take months or years. Marcus looked troubled. Mrs. Bennett, I think your situation is more precarious than we initially thought. If Margaret has comprehensive legal authority over your affairs, she might be able to move you to Sunset Manor regardless of your preferences. The weight of Margaret's deception was becoming overwhelming. She hadn't just been stealing my money, she'd been systematically removing my ability to protect myself or make independent decisions about my own life. There has to be something we can do. Marcus was quiet for several minutes, staring at the documents spread across the table. Finally, he looked up with an expression I hadn't seen before. Mrs. Bennett, what if we don't fight Margaret's legal authority directly? What if we use it against her? What do you mean? Margaret's power of attorney gives her fiduciary responsibility for your well-being. That means she's legally required to act in your best interests, not her own. If we can prove that she's been violating that fiduciary duty by stealing your money and providing you with substandard care, we might be able to have her removed as your power of attorney and potentially face criminal charges. It was a clever approach. Instead of challenging Margaret's authority directly, we would demonstrate that she had abused that authority in ways that were clearly illegal. How do we prove fiduciary duty violations? Marcus pulled his laptop back toward him. We document everything. Every instance where Margaret made decisions that benefited her financially while harming you. Every time she lied to you about your financial situation. Every time she chose a less expensive care option while telling you it was the best available. And the fact that she's been running the same scam on dozens of other families. That proves pattern and intent. It shows that Margaret's treatment of you wasn't just poor judgment or family dynamics, but part of a systematic criminal enterprise. We spent the morning refining our documentation and developing a plan of action. Marcus had to leave for his regular shift at 10 o'clock, but he promised to return that evening to help me make contact with my attorney and other potential allies. Around noon, Margaret arrived for what she announced was a final visit to Sunset Manor. She seemed unusually cheerful and energetic, probably because she thought her financial scheme was nearing completion. Mom, I spoke with the director at Sunset Manor this morning, and they're holding the room for you until tomorrow. If we sign the paperwork today, you can move in this weekend. I maintained my pleasant demeanor, while inside I was calculating how much time I had to implement our plan. That's very efficient, dear. But I was hoping to discuss a few details about the financial arrangements first. Margaret's smile flickered slightly. What kind of details, Mom? Well, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday about the trust account. If I'm moving to a less expensive facility, I'd like to understand how that affects the trust balance and what happens to the money that's not needed for my care. Mom, those are complicated financial matters that you don't need to worry about. But Margaret, I've been managing financial matters successfully for decades. Surely I can understand the basics of my own trust account. Margaret's expression shifted to the patronizing tone she used when she thought I was being difficult. Mom, you've had a stroke. Your cognitive abilities aren't what they used to be. It's not safe for you to make complex financial decisions anymore. What if I wanted to get a second opinion? From my attorney, for instance, or from Dr. Patterson. This time Margaret's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face flushed and her voice became sharp. Mom, you don't need second opinions from people who don't understand your current medical situation. I'm your daughter, and I have your best interests at heart. Dr. Patterson hasn't even seen you since you moved to Willowbrook, and Mr. Harrison is practically retired. You need to trust the family members who are actually taking care of you. The vehemence of her response confirmed what Marcus and I had suspected. Margaret was terrified of any outside scrutiny of her decisions or the financial arrangements she'd made. Of course, dear, I just thought it might be helpful to have professional advice about such important decisions. Mom, the decision has already been made. You're moving to Sunset Manor this weekend, and the financial arrangements are already in place. There's no need to complicate things by involving outsiders. Margaret's mask was slipping. The caring daughter act was being replaced by someone who sounded more like a business manager making unilateral decisions about a difficult client. What if I decided I didn't want to move? What if I wanted to stay at Willowbrook? Margaret's eyes narrowed. Mom, you don't have the legal capacity to make that kind of decision anymore. I have power of attorney, which means I make housing decisions based on what's best for you, not based on what you think you want. There it was. The truth Margaret had been hiding behind her facade of loving concern. I didn't have choices anymore. I had lost my autonomy, along with my health, and Margaret was perfectly willing to use that power to continue her financial exploitation. I see. Well, I suppose if the decision has already been made, there's nothing more to discuss. Margaret's smile returned, but it looked more like a predator's grin. I'm glad you understand, Mom. This is really for the best. You'll be much happier at Sunset Manor once you adjust to the new environment. After Margaret left, promising to return the next day with moving arrangements, I sat in my room contemplating how quickly my situation had deteriorated. Margaret wasn't just planning to steal my money, she was planning to isolate me in a substandard facility where I would have little contact with the outside world and no ability to challenge her decisions. But Margaret had made the same mistake that many criminals make when they think they're dealing with helpless victims. She had underestimated her opponent. Around 2 o'clock, I called the main number for my attorney's office. I hadn't spoken with Mr. Harrison since before my stroke, but his secretary, Mrs. Rodriguez, had been handling his appointments for over 15 years. Harrison and Associates, this is Maria. Hello, Maria, this is Eleanor Bennett. I need to schedule an appointment with Mr. Harrison as soon as possible. Mrs. Bennett. How lovely to hear from you. How are you doing? I'm doing well, thank you. But I have some urgent legal matters I need to discuss with Mr. Harrison. Of course, let me check his calendar. Would tomorrow afternoon work for you? Tomorrow afternoon I would be in transit to Sunset Manor if Margaret had her way. Maria, I'm calling from Willowbrook Gardens, where I'm currently residing. Would it be possible for Mr. Harrison to visit me here? I'm having some mobility issues that make it difficult for me to travel to his office. I'm sure that can be arranged. Mr. Harrison still makes house calls for longtime clients. Would this afternoon be too soon? This afternoon would be perfect. Wonderful. He can be there around 4 o'clock. Should I tell him what this is regarding? I paused, considering how to describe the situation without alarming Maria or providing information that might somehow get back to Margaret. It's regarding some questions about my power of attorney documents and trust account management. I need his advice about some decisions that are being made on my behalf. I'll let him know. He'll be there at 4 o'clock sharp. After hanging up, I called Dr. Patterson's office and scheduled a similar visit for the following morning. Then I contacted Mrs. Chen from the Women's Club. Eleanor, what a surprise to hear from you. How are you settling in at your new place? I'm doing well, thank you, Linda, but I'm calling because I need a favor. I'm having some concerns about my financial affairs, and I could use the perspective of someone who knows my organizational abilities and attention to detail. Mrs. Chen and I had worked together on charity fundraising events for over a decade. She knew better than anyone how meticulous I was with financial record keeping and budget management. What kind of concerns, Eleanor? The kind that require an independent review of some documents and financial records. Would you be available to visit me this evening? I have some paperwork I'd like you to look at. Of course, I can be there around 7 o'clock if that works for you. By the time Marcus returned for his evening shift, I had assembled a team of allies who could provide the credibility and expertise needed to challenge Margaret's authority and expose her criminal activities. Mrs. Bennet, I'm impressed. You've essentially created a legal and financial review board in one afternoon. Marcus, I learned a long time ago that when you're dealing with people who have power over you, you need to build coalitions. One voice can be dismissed as confusion or troublemaking. Multiple professional voices are much harder to ignore. Marcus pulled out his laptop and showed me what he'd been working on during his lunch break. I've been researching the other families affected by Robert's operation. I think I've found a way to contact some of them anonymously. What kind of way? Several of the families have adult children who are active on social media. I can create anonymous accounts and send them information about unusual financial activity related to their parents' care. If I'm careful about how I present the information, it will look like tips from a concerned whistleblower, rather than accusations. It was a clever approach. Instead of making direct contact that might be traced back to us, Marcus would plant seeds of suspicion that would lead the families to investigate their own situations. How many families can you contact this way? I've identified about 15 families where I can make contact with adult children or other relatives through social media. If even half of them start asking questions about their parents' care costs, it will create enough pressure to expose the entire operation. What about the other families? Those might require a different approach. But Mrs. Bennet, if we can get 15 families to file complaints simultaneously, the authorities will have to take the pattern seriously. Mr. Harrison arrived promptly at 4 o'clock, carrying the same leather briefcase he'd used for as long as I'd known him. At 78, he was officially semi-retired, but his mind remained sharp, and his knowledge of elder law was extensive. Eleanor, you look well. Much better than I expected given what I'd heard about your stroke. Thank you, James. What exactly had you heard? Mr. Harrison sat down at my dining table and opened his briefcase. Your daughter called my office several months ago to let me know that you'd had a serious stroke and that she would be handling your legal affairs going forward. She implied that you were no longer capable of making independent legal decisions. And what was your impression of that information? Honestly, I was surprised. Your daughter made it sound like you had suffered severe cognitive damage, but you seem perfectly lucid to me. I handed him the folder of documents Marcus and I had prepared. James, I need you to review these documents and tell me whether the powers of attorney I apparently signed are legal and whether they can be challenged. Harrison spent the next hour going through every document carefully, making notes and asking detailed questions about when and how each paper had been signed. Eleanor, I have serious concerns about several of these documents. Some of them give your daughter far more authority than is typical for standard power of attorney arrangements, and several appear to have been signed when you would have been hospitalized and possibly under the influence of medication. Are they legally valid? That's complicated. They appear to be properly notarized and witnessed, but the circumstances under which you signed them might provide grounds for challenge. More importantly, if your daughter has been using her power of attorney authority for her own benefit rather than yours, that's a clear violation of fiduciary duty. I showed him the financial documentation Marcus had helped me compile. Mr. Harrison's expression grew increasingly grave as he reviewed the evidence of Margaret's fraud operation. Eleanor, this isn't just a family dispute over money. This is evidence of systematic financial abuse and possibly elder abuse. The scope of what you're showing me suggests criminal activity that goes far beyond poor judgment or family disagreements. What do you recommend? I recommend that we file an emergency petition to have your daughter's power of attorney revoked on the grounds of abuse and self-dealing. I also recommend that we contact Adult Protective Services and the State Attorney General's office about potential criminal charges. How long would that take? If we file the petition tomorrow morning, we could potentially get a temporary restraining order that would prevent your daughter from moving you or making any other major decisions about your care until a judge can review the evidence. A temporary restraining order would buy us time, but it would also alert Margaret to the fact that I was challenging her authority. Once she knew I was fighting back, she might take steps to destroy evidence or accelerate her plans. James, what if Margaret tries to move me to the other facility before we can get a court order? If she tries to move you against your expressed wishes after we filed the petition, that would be additional evidence of abuse. But Eleanor, I have to warn you that challenging your daughter this directly is going to create a significant family conflict. I looked at this man who'd been my attorney for over 20 years, who'd helped me navigate the legal complexities of managing charitable organizations and personal affairs. James, my daughter has been systematically stealing my money while telling me it's for my own good. She's been running the same scam on dozens of other elderly people and their families. She's planning to warehouse me in a substandard facility while continuing to profit from my situation. At what point does family loyalty become complicity in criminal behavior? Mr. Harrison closed his briefcase and looked at me with something that might have been admiration. Eleanor, you're absolutely right. Sometimes protecting family means stopping them from continuing to hurt people. Mrs. Chen arrived at 7 o'clock, just as Mr. Harrison was leaving. I introduced them briefly, and she was clearly impressed by the fact that I had retained legal counsel to address my concerns. Eleanor, I have to say I'm relieved to see that you're taking charge of this situation. When Margaret told everyone at the club that you were no longer able to manage your own affairs, several of us were surprised. You've always been the most organized and financially astute person in our group. I showed Mrs. Chen the same documentation I'd shared with Mr. Harrison, focusing on the aspects that related to my organizational abilities and financial management skills. Linda, based on your knowledge of my abilities, does this financial record-keeping look like the work of someone who's cognitively impaired? Mrs. Chen studied the papers carefully. Like Mr. Harrison, she became increasingly concerned as she reviewed the evidence. Eleanor, this is meticulous documentation. The level of detail and organization is exactly what I would expect from you. Anyone who claims you're not capable of understanding financial matters is either lying or seriously misinformed. That's what I thought. Linda, I need a favor. Would you be willing to provide a written statement about my organizational abilities and mental competence? Something that could be presented to a court if necessary. Absolutely, and Eleanor, I think you should know that several of the other club members have been concerned about Margaret's claims about your condition. We've been wondering if we should visit you to see for ourselves how you're doing. This was exactly the kind of community support I'd been hoping to rebuild. Margaret had been successful in isolating me, partly because she'd convinced my friends and associates that I was no longer the person they'd known. Linda, I would love to have visitors from the club. And I think they might be interested to know that I'm far more capable than Margaret has been telling people. Marcus returned around 8 o'clock, after Mrs. Chen had left. He looked exhausted but determined. Mrs. Bennet, I've been busy. I managed to send messages to 12 families this afternoon, and 3 of them have already responded asking for more information. What kind of responses? Marcus showed me printouts of social media conversations. One family in Michigan says they've been concerned about discrepancies in their father's care costs, but didn't know how to investigate. Another family in Pennsylvania says their mother's financial statements haven't made sense for months. The third family actually thanked me for the tip and said they're planning to hire a private investigator. The speed with which other families were responding suggested that Margaret and Robert's operation was more vulnerable than they realized. Families had been having concerns, but they hadn't known how to address them or hadn't wanted to believe that their relatives might be victims of fraud. Marcus, this is excellent work. How quickly do you think we can expect these other families to take action? Based on the responses I'm getting, I think we might see complaints filed within the next week. Maybe sooner if the families are as angry as they seem to be. We spent another hour refining our plans and documentation. By the time Marcus left that evening, we had a comprehensive strategy that included legal challenges, family notifications, and evidence preservation. But as I prepared for bed, I realized that tomorrow would be the most crucial day in determining whether I would regain control of my life or become a permanent victim of Margaret's financial exploitation scheme. Margaret had announced that I would be moving to Sunset Manor over the weekend. Mr. Harrison was filing legal papers in the morning. Marcus was continuing to contact affected families. And I was about to discover whether a 74-year-old stroke survivor could successfully challenge her own daughter's authority, while exposing a criminal enterprise that had been preying on vulnerable elderly people and their families. For the first time since my stroke, I felt like I was fighting for something more important than just my own welfare. I was fighting for every elderly person who had been told they were no longer capable of protecting themselves. Every family that had been deceived by people they trusted, and every future victim of predators who saw aging and illness as opportunities rather than tragedies. Margaret had chosen the wrong victim this time. She'd assumed that having a stroke had made me helpless, but she'd forgotten that I'd spent decades protecting other people's interests and fighting for causes that mattered. Now I had a new cause, stopping her from hurting anyone else. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp October sunshine that made everything seem possible. I woke at 6 o'clock, earlier than usual, with the alertness that comes from knowing that everything in your life is about to change. Today would determine whether I remained Margaret's victim or became the architect of her downfall. I dressed carefully in my best navy blue dress and pearl earrings, the same outfit I'd worn to countless women's club meetings and charity board presentations.
If I was going to challenge my daughter's authority in court, I wanted to look like the competent, organized woman I'd always been, not like the helpless invalid Margaret had convinced everyone I'd become. Marcus arrived at 7:30 with coffee and pastries from the facility's kitchen, but more importantly, with news that would change everything. "Mrs. Bennett, you're not going to believe what happened overnight. 5 more families responded to my messages, and 2 of them have already contacted lawyers. But that's not the biggest development." He pulled out his phone and showed me a news article dated just 3 hours earlier. The headline read, "Multi-state elder fraud investigation launched after anonymous tips lead to pattern discovery." I felt my heart race as I read the article. According to the report, law enforcement agencies in Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania had received numerous complaints about fraudulent elder care billing practices, all involving similar patterns of inflated costs and suspicious trust account management. The investigation was being coordinated by a joint task force specializing in financial crimes against elderly victims. "Marcus, how did this happen so quickly?" Apparently, when multiple families in different states file similar complaints within a 24-hour period, it triggers automatic cross-referencing in law enforcement databases. The pattern was so obvious that they launched a formal investigation immediately. This was beyond what we'd hoped for. Instead of fighting Margaret's authority as an isolated family dispute, we were now part of a larger criminal investigation that would have federal resources and multi-state jurisdiction. What does this mean for our situation? It means that when Mr. Harrison files his petition this morning, he'll be doing so in the context of an active criminal investigation. Courts take elder abuse cases much more seriously when there's evidence of broader criminal activity. At 8 o'clock, Dr. Patterson arrived for the medical evaluation I'd requested. Dr. Patterson had been my physician for over 15 years, and he knew my medical history better than anyone. More importantly, he had extensive experience with stroke patients and cognitive assessment. "Eleanor, I have to say you look remarkably well for someone who's supposedly suffering from severe cognitive decline." I handed him copies of the neurological assessments that had been done immediately after my stroke, along with more recent evaluations from Willowbrook's medical staff. "David, I'd like you to review these assessments and give me your professional opinion about my cognitive abilities and decision-making capacity." Patterson spent 45 minutes conducting his own informal cognitive assessment, asking me questions about current events, having me solve simple mathematical problems, and testing my memory and reasoning abilities.
His conclusion was exactly what I'd hoped to hear. Eleanor, based on my examination and review of your medical records, you show no signs of significant cognitive impairment. Yes, you've had some minor word-finding difficulties since your stroke, and you may have slightly slower processing speed for complex tasks, but your reasoning ability, memory, and judgment appear to be entirely intact. Would you be willing to provide written documentation of that assessment? Absolutely. And Eleanor, I'm concerned about the discrepancy between your actual condition and what your daughter has been telling people. Has anyone conducted a formal competency evaluation since your stroke? Not that I'm aware of. Margaret told everyone that it wasn't necessary because my deficits were obvious. Dr. Patterson's expression darkened. Eleanor, that's not how competency determinations work. Legal competency requires formal evaluation by qualified professionals, not assumptions by family members. If your daughter has been making major decisions about your care and finances without proper competency assessment, that's a serious problem. At 9 o'clock, Mr. Harrison called to update me on his morning's activities. The news was better than I'd dared hope. Eleanor, I've filed the emergency petition to revoke your daughter's power of attorney, and I've been in contact with the Joint Task Force investigating the elder fraud cases. They're very interested in your documentation and want to interview you as soon as possible. What kind of interview? They want to hear your account of how Margaret gained control of your finances and what evidence you have of fraudulent activity. Your case appears to be one of the most well-documented examples they've seen. When do they want to meet? This afternoon if possible. They're concerned that your daughter might try to move you to the other facility before they can secure the evidence they need. It seemed that law enforcement had the same concerns about timing that Marcus and I had discussed. Once Margaret realized that her operation was being exposed, she might take desperate actions to cover her tracks or silence potential witnesses. James, what's the status of the court petition? We're scheduled for an emergency hearing at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Given the criminal investigation and the evidence we've presented, I'm optimistic that the judge will grant a temporary restraining order preventing your daughter from making any major decisions about your care until the matter can be fully reviewed. Everything was moving faster than I'd expected, but that was probably for the best. Margaret was planning to move me tomorrow, which meant we had less than 24 hours to stop her. At 10:30, Margaret arrived for what she clearly expected to be a routine visit to finalize the moving arrangements. She was carrying a clipboard with official-looking documents and seemed unusually businesslike. "Good morning, Mom. I have the paperwork for your transfer to Sunset Manor. We just need your signature on a few forms, and then we can finish packing your things this afternoon." I looked at my daughter, this woman I'd raised and loved and trusted, and felt a mixture of sadness and determination that surprised me with its intensity. "Margaret, before I sign anything, I'd like to discuss something with you." "What kind of something, Mom? We're on a tight schedule today." "I'd like to understand more about the Bennett Family Trust and how the financial arrangements for my care actually work." Margaret's expression shifted to the patronizing smile she used when she thought I was being difficult. "Mom, we've discussed this before. Those are complicated financial matters that you don't need to worry about. But what if I want to worry about them? What if I want to understand how my own money is being managed?" "Mom, you've had a stroke. Complex financial management isn't safe for you anymore. That's why I'm handling everything for you." I stood up from my chair and walked to my dresser, retrieving the folder of documentation Marcus and I had compiled. Margaret watched with growing unease as I returned to the table and spread the papers out in front of her. "Margaret, I'd like you to explain these financial records to me." Margaret's face went pale as she looked at bank statements showing the transfers from my accounts to BRT Holdings, documentation of the inflated care costs, and evidence of the fraudulent trust account management. "Where did you get these?" "From the same sources you've been using to manage my affairs." "Margaret, I want you to explain to me why my savings account has been reduced from $200,000 to $37,000 while you've been telling me that my care is being paid for by a trust fund." Margaret's hands were shaking as she looked through the papers. "Mom, these numbers are taken out of context. The financial arrangements are complicated, and you're not understanding them correctly. Then explain them to me. Explain why Robert's company has been receiving money from my trust account.
Explain why other families are paying inflated costs for elder care while their money is being diverted to the same company. Explain why you've been telling people I'm cognitively impaired while you've been systematically stealing my money. Margaret's composure cracked completely. The caring daughter act disappeared, replaced by someone who looked cornered and desperate. Mom, you don't understand what you're talking about. You're confused and paranoid, and you're going to embarrass yourself by making accusations you can't prove. Margaret, I'm not confused and I'm not paranoid. I'm angry. I'm angry that you've been stealing from me while pretending to protect me. I'm angry that you've been lying to my friends and my doctor about my condition. And I'm especially angry that you've been running the same scam on other families while their elderly relatives trusted you to provide them with good care. Margaret stood up abruptly, grabbing the clipboard with the transfer documents. Mom, you're having an episode. This kind of paranoid thinking is exactly why you need supervised care. I'm going to call Dr. Richards at Willowbrook and have him evaluate your mental state. Dr. Patterson already conducted that evaluation this morning. He found no evidence of cognitive impairment or compromised decision-making ability. He also said that formal competency evaluations should have been conducted before you were given power of attorney authority. Margaret's eyes narrowed dangerously. Dr. Patterson hasn't been treating you since your stroke. His opinion isn't relevant to your current condition. What about the opinion of the Joint Task Force investigating elder fraud in multiple states? Would their opinion be relevant? Margaret froze. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the federal investigation that was launched yesterday after multiple families filed complaints about fraudulent elder care billing practices. I'm talking about the investigation that's focusing on companies like BRT Holdings and the facilities they work with to overcharge families while providing substandard care. Margaret's face cycled through several emotions before settling on cold rage. Mom, I don't know who's been filling your head with these conspiracy theories, but you're making a serious mistake. You're going to Sunset Manor tomorrow, whether you want to or not, and you're going to sign these papers because I have legal authority to make those decisions for you. Actually, you don't. I pulled out the legal documents Mr. Harrison had left with me. As of 9 o'clock this morning, your power of attorney authority has been challenged in court on the grounds of fiduciary duty violations and self-dealing. There's an emergency hearing scheduled for 2 o'clock this afternoon. Margaret snatched the papers from my hand and read them quickly. When she looked up, her expression was unlike anything I'd ever seen from her before. You can't do this. You're not competent to challenge legal documents. No court is going to take the word of a stroke patient over the documented decisions of a responsible family member. Margaret, multiple medical professionals have evaluated my competency and found me to be entirely capable of making my own decisions. Multiple financial experts have reviewed the evidence of your fraudulent activity, and multiple law enforcement agencies are investigating your criminal enterprise. Margaret began pacing around my small room, her composure completely shattered. This is insane. You're ruining everything over money that was being used for your own care. Do you have any idea how expensive it's been to keep you in this place? Do you know how much I've had to sacrifice to make sure you get good care? Margaret, you haven't sacrificed anything. You've been stealing my money while charging inflated rates to cover care that costs a fraction of what you've been claiming. You've been profiting from my stroke while telling everyone that you're making sacrifices to help me. That's not true. Robert and I have been managing complex financial arrangements to ensure that you get the best possible care while protecting your assets for the future. I looked at my daughter and realized that she might actually believe her own lies. She'd been telling herself that her theft was justified, that her victims were better off, that she was providing a service rather than committing crimes. Margaret, sitting in my room right now are copies of financial records showing that you and Robert have stolen over $200,000 per month from elderly people and their families. You've been running a criminal enterprise that preys on people during the most vulnerable periods of their lives. There is no justification for what you've done. Margaret stopped pacing and looked at me with something that might have been recognition. For just a moment, I thought she might acknowledge what she'd done, might express some remorse or attempt to make amends. Instead, she walked to my phone and unplugged it from the wall. Mom, you're not going to any court hearing. You're not talking to any investigators. You're moving to Sunset Manor this afternoon, and you're going to stop making these ridiculous accusations before you cause serious problems for people who've been trying to help you. I realized that Margaret had moved beyond denial into something much more dangerous. She was no longer trying to convince me that her actions were justified. She was trying to prevent me from exposing her by any means necessary. Margaret, you can't force me to move anywhere. The court petition specifically requests that you be prevented from making any major decisions about my care until the hearing. The court doesn't know what's best for you. I'm your daughter, and I know that you need supervised care in a controlled environment where you can't make impulsive decisions that could hurt yourself or other people. Margaret was now talking about me like I was a dangerous psychiatric patient rather than her mother. The transformation was both frightening and revealing. Margaret, I want you to leave my room now. I want you to leave Willowbrook, and I don't want you to contact me again until this legal matter is resolved. Margaret's laugh was harsh and humorless. Mom, I have power of attorney. You don't get to decide who visits you or who makes decisions about your care. I'm taking you to Sunset Manor today because that's what's best for you, and no court petition is going to change that. She walked to my closet and began pulling out clothes, stuffing them into a suitcase she'd apparently brought with her. Margaret, stop, I'm not going anywhere with you. Yes, you are. And if you try to resist, I'll have the staff at Willowbrook sedate you for your own safety during the transfer. I realized that Margaret was serious. She was planning to have me forcibly removed from Willowbrook and taken to Sunset Manor, probably before the court hearing could take place. Once I was isolated at the other facility, it would be much more difficult for law enforcement to reach me or for my legal team to protect me. I needed help, and I needed it immediately. Fortunately, I'd been preparing for this possibility. I walked to my bathroom and locked the door behind me. From my toiletry bag, I retrieved the cell phone Marcus had given me the night before, programmed with emergency contact numbers for Mr. Harrison, Dr. Patterson, and the Joint Task Force investigators. Mr. Harrison, this is Eleanor Bennett. Margaret is here, and she's trying to force me to leave Willowbrook immediately. She's packing my things and threatening to have me sedated if I resist. Eleanor, stay calm, I'm calling the police right now to have them enforce the court petition. Don't leave your room and don't go anywhere with your daughter until law enforcement arrives. How long will that take? They should be there within 15 minutes. Can you stay safe until then? I could hear Margaret banging on the bathroom door demanding that I come out immediately. I think so, but Mr. Harrison, Margaret seems desperate. I'm not sure what she might do if she realizes that her entire operation is about to be exposed. Eleanor, you've been incredibly brave to challenge this situation. Just hold on a little longer and help will be there. I called Dr. Patterson next, asking him to come to Willowbrook immediately to provide medical evaluation and support if Margaret tried to claim that I was having some kind of medical emergency. Finally, I called the number Marcus had given me for the task force investigators. This is Agent Rodriguez with the Elder Fraud Task Force. This is Eleanor Bennett. I believe you wanted to interview me about the financial fraud operation involving my daughter and son-in-law. Mrs. Bennett, yes, we're very interested in speaking with you. We were planning to come to Willowbrook this afternoon. Agent Rodriguez, my daughter is here right now trying to force me to leave Willowbrook and move to another facility before your interview can take place. I'm concerned that she's trying to prevent me from cooperating with your investigation. Mrs. Bennett, stay exactly where you are. We're dispatching officers to Willowbrook immediately. Do not leave the facility with your daughter under any circumstances. When I emerged from the bathroom 10 minutes later, Margaret was sitting on my bed with her head in her hands. She looked up when I entered, and I was shocked to see that she'd been crying. Mom, please don't do this. Please don't destroy our family over money. Can't we work something out privately? For the first time since this confrontation began, Margaret sounded like my daughter rather than a desperate criminal. But I'd learned too much about the scope of her crimes to be swayed by emotional appeals. Margaret, this stopped being about our family the moment you started stealing from other people's families. This stopped being about money the moment you decided to warehouse me in a substandard facility while telling people it was for my own good. I never meant for things to go this far. It started as a way to manage your care costs more efficiently, and then it just got complicated. Margaret, you've been running this operation for years. You've stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from vulnerable elderly people. You've lied to families about their relatives' care costs while providing them with inadequate services. There's nothing efficient or accidental about what you've done. Margaret stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot. Mom, if you cooperate with this investigation, Robert and I are going to prison. My children are going to grow up knowing that their mother is a felon. Our lives are going to be destroyed. Margaret, your lives are going to be destroyed because of choices you made, not because of anything I'm doing to stop you. She turned back toward me, and I could see that the brief moment of vulnerability was over. Her expression was cold and calculating again. Mom, you're making a mistake that you're going to regret. When this is over, when the courts and the investigators realize that you're not competent to make these kinds of accusations, you're going to be moved to a facility with much less independence than Sunset Manor. You're going to spend the rest of your life in a locked ward with no visitors, and no ability to make trouble for the people who are trying to take care of you. It was a threat delivered with the casual confidence of someone who'd been manipulating vulnerable people for years. Before I could respond, I heard voices in the hallway outside my room. A moment later, there was a firm knock on my door. Springfield Police, we're here regarding an emergency court petition. Margaret's face went completely white. She looked toward the door, then toward the window, then back at me with something that looked like hatred. This isn't over, Mom. You have no idea what you've just started. I walked to the door and opened it to find two police officers. Mr. Harrison, and a woman in a business suit, who introduced herself as Agent Rodriguez from the Elder Fraud Task Force. Mrs. Bennett, we're here to ensure that the court's temporary restraining order is enforced. Your daughter is not permitted to make any decisions about your care or residence until the emergency hearing this afternoon. Margaret gathered her purse and walked toward the door, but Agent Rodriguez stepped into her path. Miss Bennett, I need to ask you to stay for a few minutes. We have some questions about BRT Holdings and the financial arrangements for your mother's care. Margaret's last attempt at maintaining her composure failed completely. I want a lawyer. I'm not answering any questions without legal representation. That's your right, ma'am. But we're executing search warrants for BRT Holdings' financial records and your personal accounts, and we'll be interviewing all of the families affected by your billing practices. As Margaret was escorted from my room by the police officers, she turned back one final time. Mom, I hope this was worth it. I hope destroying your own daughter's life was worth whatever satisfaction you think you're going to get from this. After everyone else had left, Agent Rodriguez sat down at my dining table and pulled out a digital recorder. Mrs. Bennett, we'd like to hear your account of how your daughter gained control of your finances and what evidence you have of fraudulent activity. I spent the next 2 hours providing a detailed account of everything that had happened since my stroke. Agent Rodriguez was particularly interested in the documentation Marcus and I had compiled and the methods Margaret had used to convince everyone that I was incapable of managing my own affairs. Mrs. Bennett, your case is one of the most thoroughly documented examples of elder financial abuse we've ever encountered. The evidence you've provided is going to be crucial in prosecuting not just your daughter and son-in-law, but the entire network of facilities and individuals they've been working with. What happens now? Now we finish our investigation, arrest the people responsible, and work on recovering as much of the stolen money as possible. Your daughter and son-in-law are going to face federal charges for wire fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse. Given the scope of their operation, they're looking at significant prison sentences. The emergency court hearing that afternoon was almost anticlimactic. The judge reviewed the evidence, heard testimony from Dr. Patterson about my competency, and immediately revoked Margaret's power of attorney while ordering a full investigation into her financial management of my affairs. More importantly, the judge appointed an independent conservator to oversee my financial affairs until I could demonstrate that I was fully capable of managing them independently. It was a temporary measure, but it meant that I would have professional oversight to help me rebuild my financial security and independence. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in my new apartment in a senior living community that I had chosen for myself, reading newspaper coverage of the arrests and indictments in what the media was calling the Golden Years fraud scandal. Margaret and Robert had been arrested on federal charges including conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering, and elder abuse. 12 other individuals connected to their operation had also been charged, including administrators at several elder care facilities who had participated in the billing fraud. The investigation had uncovered evidence that the operation had stolen over $2 million from 43 families across 4 states over a period of 3 years. Marcus had been offered a full scholarship to complete his computer science degree and a job with the FBI's cybercrime unit after graduation.
He'd been instrumental in documenting the digital evidence that led to the convictions, and his work had helped recover over 60% of the stolen funds for the victims. Patterson had submitted a formal complaint to the state medical board about the lack of proper competency evaluation in my case, leading to new protocols for assessing elderly patients' decision-making abilities. Mrs. Chen and the Riverside Women's Club had established a support network for elderly individuals who were concerned about financial abuse by family members, using my case as an example of how to fight back against exploitation. As for me, I'd recovered most of my stolen money through the criminal restitution process and civil lawsuits. More importantly, I'd recovered my independence, my dignity, and my confidence in my own abilities. I still had some lingering effects from my stroke. I still occasionally struggled to find the right word or felt fatigued more easily than I had before. But I'd learned that having some physical limitations didn't make me helpless, and that age and illness didn't disqualify me from protecting myself and others. Margaret had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Robert had received 10 years due to his role as the primary architect of the financial schemes. Neither of them had shown remorse during their trials, continuing to maintain that they had been providing valuable services to families who didn't understand the complexities of elder care. I'd chosen not to attend their sentencing hearings. I'd said everything I needed to say during the investigation and trials. The justice system had delivered appropriate consequences for their crimes, and I preferred to focus on rebuilding my life, rather than dwelling on their punishment. The hardest part hadn't been the legal proceedings or the media attention. The hardest part had been accepting that my own daughter had seen my stroke not as a tragedy to help me overcome, but as an opportunity to exploit for her own benefit. But I'd also learned something important about the difference between being a victim and being defeated. Margaret had turned me into a victim through her lies and theft, but she hadn't defeated me. She'd underestimated my intelligence, my determination, and my ability to fight back when fighting back mattered. More than that, she'd underestimated the power of community and the willingness of good people to help when someone was being hurt. Marcus could have ignored my request for help and focused on his own studies and work. Mr. Harrison could have dismissed my concerns as the confusion of an elderly stroke patient. Dr. Patterson could have avoided getting involved in what appeared to be a family dispute. Instead, each of them had chosen to listen, to investigate, and to act when they discovered that someone was being victimized by people who were supposed to protect her. 6 months after the trials ended, I received a letter from a woman in Oregon, whose elderly mother had been a victim of a similar financial fraud scheme. She'd read about my case in a magazine article, and wanted to thank me for fighting back publicly. Your courage to challenge your daughter's authority gave me the strength to investigate my brother's management of our mother's finances, she wrote. We discovered that he'd been stealing from her for 2 years. Because of the precedent set by your case and the legal strategies your attorney used, we were able to recover most of her money and get him prosecuted for elder abuse. Our mother is now living independently again and managing her own affairs with appropriate support rather than fraudulent exploitation. Letters like that one reminded me why I'd chosen to fight rather than accept Margaret's version of my future. It hadn't been just about my money or my independence, though both of those things mattered enormously. It had been about refusing to let criminals use aging and illness as excuses for victimization. Every elderly person who'd been told they were no longer competent to make their own decisions deserved to have those decisions evaluated by qualified professionals, rather than self-interested family members. Every family dealing with the challenges of caring for aging relatives deserved honest information about care costs and options rather than fraudulent schemes designed to maximize profits. And every person who'd ever been underestimated because of age, illness, or disability deserved to know that they still had the right to fight back when someone tried to take advantage of their vulnerability.
Margaret had seen my stroke as the beginning of my decline into helplessness. Instead, it had become the beginning of the most important battle of my life, and a battle I'd won not just for myself, but for every person who refused to let criminals define the terms of their survival. At 74, I'd learned that being a victim was sometimes unavoidable, but staying a victim was always a choice. And I'd chosen to fight back with everything I had, using every skill I'd developed and every ally I could find, until justice was served, and the people who'd tried to exploit me were held accountable for their crimes. The best part was knowing that Margaret had been wrong about everything. Wrong about my competence, wrong about my helplessness, wrong about my ability to fight back, and most importantly, wrong about her ability to get away with her crimes. I might have had a stroke, but my mind was sharp, my determination was stronger than ever, and my capacity for protecting myself and others from predators had never been more focused or effective. Margaret had gambled that a 74-year-old stroke survivor would be too confused and frightened to challenge her authority. She'd lost that gamble in the most decisive way possible, and her defeat had protected dozens of other families from experiencing the same betrayal and financial exploitation. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's simply refusing to be the victim that someone else has decided you should be, and fighting back with such determination and effectiveness that the predators end up behind bars, while their intended victims reclaim their lives and their dignity. That's exactly what had happened to Margaret and Robert, and it's exactly what I'd hoped would happen from the moment I first heard my daughter planning to warehouse me in a cheap facility, while stealing the money meant for my care. Justice had been served, consequences had been delivered, and the people who'd tried to exploit my vulnerability had learned that underestimating elderly victims could be the most expensive mistake of their criminal careers. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.